Welcome back to our course on Excel 2013. If you ask experienced Microsoft Excel users what they consider to be the great strengths of Microsoft Excel, they very often say that its greatest feature is its ability to do really impressive graphs and charts. But sometimes people forget that the other feature that underlies all of that is Excel's ability to store lots of data and to do really complex calculations based on that data. In other words, to put together the data on which the graphs and charts are drawn. Another very strong feature that people talk about is Excel's ability to do analysis on sets of data, and we'll be coming back to that later in the course as well. But again, the basis of that is Excel's ability to do very sophisticated and complex calculations reliably and quickly on very large sets of data. Now in this section, what we're going to start to look at is how to set up Excel to do these complex calculations. And I'm going to start by using a very straightforward example to illustrate what's going on. I'm back at our expenses sheet here, and so far all of this data has been typed in. We've got dates, client names, descriptions, costs, recharge, etc. What if I wanted a total of all of these costs? Well, of course, I could add them up in my head, or I could get my calculator out. But there's a very quick way of summing some data in Excel, and it's this. If I select the first cell, drag down, and include the cell below that one, and then if I go up here on the Home tab, in the Editing group, and go to this button which has got the sigma sign there, and I just click on that sign, look what happens. What Excel does is to total those figures for me. That's the total cost, $196.95. So how does it do that? Well, when I perform an operation like the one that I just performed there, what it does is it puts something that's going to look a little unusual in that final cell. And the cell that says $196.95, if I click on that cell, which is E9, look what it says in the formula bar. It doesn't say $196.95, it says equals sign, sum, then it's got a round bracket E3 colon E8. Now the E3 colon E8 bit is similar to something we saw much earlier on in the course. It specifies a range of cells. It cells from E3 to E8. That's what's called a range. Sum is what's called a function. Excel has many hundreds and hundreds of functions, and sum is one of the simplest ones, and as the name implies, it's the sum of what's in the range, so it's E3 to E8. And perhaps most importantly of all, right at the beginning, it's got an equal sign. The equal sign makes this a formula. So the content of this cell is not just a number, it's not just something we type in, there is a formula, there's something to calculate. And when we do the calculation, or more specifically when Excel does the calculation, it uses the function sum on the range E3 to E8. Now, as you'll see later on, we don't always have just one range and one function. This can become very complicated, but in its simplest form, that really encapsulates the whole of what formulas and functions are about in Excel 2013. Now what I'm going to do is to undo what I just did. I'm going to leave the selection as it is, and I'm going to go back up in the Editing group on the Home tab, click the drop down next to Sigma, and I'm going to look at one of the other available functions, and one of the other available functions is max. If I click in the cell, note the formula is different, equals max capitals max E3 to E8. I'm sure you can see what that is. It says which is the maximum value in that range. So let me just undo that again, and let's look at some of these other available functions from here. If I click on that drop down again, I'm sure you can guess what average will do. and count numbers. We'll count how many numbers there are in the range. Down here we have more functions. Now, as I mentioned before, there are many functions in Excel, and if you're looking for a function to do a particular thing for you, you may well not know what it's called. The way that Excel 2013 helps you out in this respect is that it gives you a search facility. Type a brief description of what you want to do and then click go. I'll show you how that works in a moment. But there's also a category selection drop down here. If I click on this drop down, it says, do you want to look at the most recently used functions, the ones you've used most frequently? Do you want all functions? That's a very long list. Financial, date and time, math and trig, and so on. Various categories. And if you particularly want, say, statistical functions at any time, if you click on statistical functions, there's a list of the statistical functions. There are many just of those. But let's try this search feature. So suppose you want to do something to do with statistics. Say you want a median function. You know it's to do with finding the median of some numbers. Click on go. And there you are, there is a median function. It tells you about it underneath the list and then gives you some other functions that involve a median in some way. Things to do with quartiles and so on. If you know anything about statistics, you probably have a reasonable idea of what all that means. So you can usually find the function that you want using this. So even with the context of dealing with a group of numbers like these, you can use that facility to find the function you want to perform an operation. We've already done the sum, we've done the max, and we now know how we would find a function to do the median. But now let's take a look at the formula side of things. Let's move away from functions. We're going to come back to those later on. Let's look at the formula side of things. Let me choose a cell at random, that cell there, and let me type in the formula bar a formula. And the formula I'm going to type is this: equals E3 plus E8. Now that's a very simple formula, and as I type it, note it highlights the cells that appear in that formula. E3 is here, it's got a sort of blue selection rectangle around it with corners. E3 6550, and E8 is also highlighted here, got a red border around it, 3625. Once I've typed that formula, if I enter that formula, what am I going to get? I'm going to get $101.75, which is the sum of those two. And I did that without using a sum function, just did it as a straight addition. Similarly, if I wanted to change that formula, click in there again. Note, as soon as I click in, the cells that are involved in the calculation are again highlighted. But I'm going to change now the plus to a minus. Enter again, $29.25. And I can, of course, extend the formula. So why don't I say plus E6? Formula there, tick, that's it. So the way the formula works is, provided you've got the equal sign there, then you can pretty much type any numbers in there that you like. So let's try something else. I'm going to now select this cell, and I'm going to once again type a formula in this cell, and it's going to be equals to, the asterisk is the multiplication symbol, E3. So it equals 2 times E3. Now notice, if I tick now, the answer is $131. Now in this formula, Excel knows that E3 is a cell reference. It always recognizes cell references in that way, by you giving the column number then the row number, although in fact there's more than one way of doing cell references, as I will refer briefly to later on. But in this context it knows that E3 is a cell, whereas it knows that 2 is a constant. So I could here write equals 2 times E3, and that particular column now in my table would tell me that that's $131 is twice 65.50. If I had a reason to double it, that would do the job. Now we come to another very important point, and that is this. If I now select down and then go to the fill button that we saw before, that's this one, and do fill down, watch what happens. I don't get $131 in each of those cells. I get in each of those cells a figure that is double the equivalent cost figure. And if I click on the second one down, the one that's 37.80, look at the formula. It's not 2 times E3, it's 2 times E4. What Excel does is, if I fill, or in fact if I do things like copy and paste, but if I fill down, right, up, left with a formula, it works out what the equivalent formula is depending on the type of fill or copy or paste or whatever I'm doing. So it says here, right, the top one was 2 times E3. We're going down the rows, so the one underneath it must be 2 times E4, and the one underneath that must be 2 times E5, and so on. So it's clever enough to extend the formula to basically generalize the formula to the other entries on our sheet. Now I've got a couple of other very important things to point out here. One of the important things to point out is, supposing I try another formula here, and here I put equals 2 times, and this time I'm going to do D3. Now D3 is the description, train fare New York to Atlantic City. What do you think is going to happen if I enter that formula? I'm going to get that thing, hash value exclamation mark. You are going to see hash value exclamation mark a lot when you use Excel, because basically it means you're doing some kind of invalid calculation. You cannot multiply train fare New York to Atlantic City text by 2, or indeed by any other number, so you get that in the cell. And to the left of it you get this little warning sign here. If you click on that, it gives you a screen tip. A value used in the formula is of the wrong data type, so that normally tells you what's wrong. But if you click on the little drop down there, you have an option of help on this error, show the calculation steps, ignore the error. We're going to look at some of those later on, but basically when you get that, you've got something wrong with your formula. And the final thing to point out, if I say click on G6, $65.60, and the formula is equals 2 times E6. You may or may not have noticed this when we were looking at copy and paste earlier on, but this means that a cell like G6 has 2 distinctly different properties. One property is the formula. Bear in mind, not every cell has a formula. Some cells have formulas. The cells in column G have formulas, whereas the ones in column E don't. But a cell can have a formula and it can have a value. And sometimes when you're pasting a cell like this, you have to be specific about whether you want to paste the formula. Do you want the formula or do you want the value? Because sometimes you'll want one and not the other. So in this section I've really introduced you to formulas and functions, shown you a couple of examples and talked about some of the approaches and terminology. There's a lot more to find out about formulas and functions, and that's what we're going to continue with in the next section. So please join me for that.